This man, Boris, has just made a huge mistake that even a child can understand will trash our economy and ruin many lives. This video explains why. He plans to treble onshore wind farms, with the result that an extra 7,400 turbines will be added to our landscape. Well, Boris may think he's as good as Batman, but the facts are he's the biggest enemy of bats there's ever been, because wind farms kill bats in the hundreds of thousands, as well as birds and insects. They may look slow turning, but in actual fact that tip is travelling at about 150 miles an hour. The fatalities are enormous. In Spain, an estimated 6 to 18 million bats and birds a year are killed. In Germany, over 200,000 bats and 3,500 tons of insects are killed each year. The estimate in California alone is 320,000 bats a year. The animals simply do not understand what is happening here, and here is a very sad example of just what happens. This is a sad story of a rare visitor to our shores. It's the fastest flying bird in the world, and it's the white-throated needletail. Not seen in the UK for some 22 years. It appeared in the Hebrides, and 40 birdwatchers quickly got there to be able to spot it, only to witness that it wasn't fast enough for the wind turbine and was killed right in front of their eyes. Yet despite this incredible danger to birds, organisations such as the RSPB are swept away in a tide of ignorance about climate change. When will this madness stop? Where the doctrine is more important than the environment, where the politics lead and not the science. No mad plan ever survives reality. So we'll now take a look at the insanity of the Boris agenda, and keep in mind this agenda is being promoted once the country is in a huge cost of living crisis, most of which is caused by our government's bad planning. And when I say governments, I mean the last 25 years or so. So there are the costs of offshore wind compared to onshore wind. Offshore wind has proved incredibly expensive and costs about 3 times as much as onshore wind, which is why Boris has swapped from offshore to onshore. Simple costs. So how do onshore wind farms compete on price with gas? Well, they're at least twice as expensive as gas. But it becomes even worse than that when you consider another factor. A group of MPs looked at 3 wind farms in Scotland and came to the conclusion that about 50% of the time the wind farms were paid not to give us energy. They had to be switched off, but we still had to pay them as if they generated the energy. And of course that would double the cost to the consumer of something that was already twice the price of gas, and so could be as much as 4 times the price of gas. I will explain. Obviously, we do not control how much wind blows and when it blows. That's down to nature. The second step in the logic is simply that overnight we demand less electricity than during the day. During the day we're up and about, and of course industry is more active. So this is a typical energy demand curve in the UK, and as you can see, overnight the demand is much lower. Because we cannot rely on the intermittent nature of wind, we cannot use the base load at night to rely on wind, because it might not be there, we'd have no power at all. So overnight we need something like nuclear, something stable like that, And by the way, nuclear these days, such as the stable salt reactor, can't even melt down. They're very, very safe. But nevertheless, nuclear, coal, things like that are typical baseloads. They take care of this baseload line. So in a perfect world, nuclear, which can't be changed quickly, would be there to cover the 24 hours, what we call baseload. And the top of that, you need something to generate the variable load. We do have things like pump storage, but they're pretty well utilized. And so the only real viable option is gas or wind. But as we say, wind is intermittent. So let's give one example here, why we're paying for them not to produce wind. Say it's overnight now, we're taken care of by the nuclear, by the baseload power generation, and it gets windy and blows. There's now a lot of extra energy, but there's no demand for it. So that lack of demand for the energy means we have to say to the wind producers, sorry, we don't want this power, turn off your turbines, but we'll still pay you with a compensation payment. And that can be as much as almost 50%, as per the case study by the MPs. The fact that wind can blow at night should not be a surprise. So here we are, paying for power not to be produced, that already before that cost twice as much or more than gas. In a perfect world, we would simply have the nuclear as a base and gas as the variable. So now let's flip the opposite case, which is when the wind doesn't blow at all. Some people think, well, the wind always blows somewhere. But in actual fact, the wind does not always blow. It can stop. And it has stopped for as much as 9 days in the recent past. What do we do then? And the only thing we can do is bring in a fast reaction power source, and the only suitable one is gas. We cannot afford to turn the gas off. The simple fact is that we have to build gas power stations to the equivalent amount of any wind power stations so as to cover that situation when there's no wind. And if you had that gas capacity, then you wouldn't need the wind power at all, because you'd be duplicating it with one side costing up to 4 times more than the gas. But if Boris trebles the amount of wind power and we rely on it even more than we do today, then this is going to not only increase costs enormously, it's going to lead to blackouts and brownouts where they ration the amount of energy you're given. And this is part of his plan, because believe it or not, as a right-wing or supposedly conservative government, they plan to nationalise the power grid and therefore have a new body that has as its number one objective net zero. And that net zero, by the way, comes before you and your bills and your standard of living. And just to ensure they have control, you are banned, suspended and punished simply for opposing this ridiculous doctrine. But you can be certain of one thing, it is your pockets that they'll be emptying. And even if the green lobby were true about CO2, and they are not, by the way, because we're already at saturated limits of CO2, and the UK representing less than 1% of the world output of CO2, China building 1,300 coal power stations now, it has no effect at all on the objective. What is happening is all the Western countries are reducing CO2, but the CO2 still continues to rise. All the COP meetings make no difference at all, and all of this effort is to no effect whatsoever. Of course, it's not just me that is pointing out this madness. Lord Frost has gone public declaring it's a stupid policy. He may not be as blunt as myself, but basically he sees it, and many people do. The public, you, are being asked to pay a fortune extra in energy costs, and that feeds into all sorts of product costs, for the vanity of Boris Johnson on the world stage to strut and say, look what we are doing.
We in the developed world must recognise the special responsibility we have to help everybody else to do it, because it was here in Glasgow 250 years ago that James Watt came up with a machine that was powered by steam, that was produced by burning coal. And yes, my friends, we've brought you to the very place where the doomsday machine began to tick. And even though for 200 years the industrialized countries were in complete ignorance of the problem that they were creating, we now have a duty to find those funds.
There are really so many ridiculous statements inside that short speech there. But we'll start with this one, a duty to find those funds. This is about a transfer of wealth to the third world from the developed world. So at the end of the day, you're expected to guide yourself through a maze of misinformation, a maze of gloom and doom predictions, all of which are wrong. At the end of the day, the result is about a transfer of wealth from the developed world to the underdeveloped world. You should not be puzzled as to why this is. It's because the IPCC, the governing body in the UN, if you like, that's the heart of all this alarmism, is not a scientific body. It's a political body, and the vast majority of the votes in that are with the underdeveloped world. So the science is ignored as they plough the furrow of wanting more money. Now let's go back to Boris and listen to what he has to say about our guilt, about how we started the whole carbon thing.
We in the developed world must recognize the special responsibility we have to help everybody else to do it. Because it was here in Glasgow 250 years ago that James Watt came up with a machine that was powered by steam that was produced by burning coal.
And that's the same Boris government today that's asking the coal power plants to stay on rather than close as planned. But back to the main point here. The Little Ice Age reached its depth in the 1600s. And in fact, the Great Frost dates back to then, and that was the biggest recession before we had the 2008 one. And it was warming for 150 years before the Industrial Revolution. This is important because the warming was occurring naturally. All of that is ignored. Now, of course, mankind has contributed to warming, and it's been of great benefit to mankind. But the point here is that somehow we should feel guilty because we gave the world the Industrial Revolution that revolutionized the quality of life for everybody throughout the world, from sanitation, public health, engineering, sewers, from transport, from medical science. All of this came from the Industrial Revolution. And somehow we are to pay for the fact we gave the world this. But carbon is the very essence of life. We're made of it. Our plants developed in much higher carbon levels than today. And I've done a whole video on this. Go and look at my video, More CO2 Please, to explain more of this. So this idea of guilt is absurd. Climate alarmism of today has become a cult, a religion that wants us to believe in self-flagellation, a religion that wants us to punish ourselves. And Boris is leading in that self-flagellation. His absurd energy policy is one of the main ways he is doing that. And you are paying for it. Incredibly, well, according to Boris, we've been putting this carbon poison in the air since 1850 when the Industrial Revolution started. He wants to go back to that. Well, those were super low drought levels of CO2, accidentally achieved as the Earth over the millennia has absorbed the CO2 into limestone, etc. In fact, it was at CO2 drought levels of 285 parts per million. And so plants required a lot more water to even begin to grow. But just look at this greenhouse where you pump in different levels of CO2. That first small tree is actually at much higher levels of 385 parts per million. And look how plants grow as you increase the CO2. Now imagine what we'd be returning to for all the food in the world when we starved them of CO2 as they were being starved in the CO2 drought of 1850. With today's world population, there would actually be widespread world famine.